We are pushing on, and we have 3 speakers coming up to deepen our thinking, give us some other directions. And we're beginning with Victor Asal, Ph.D., Associate Professor of Political Science, Director of the Center for Policy Research, and co-director of the Project on Violent Conflict, Rockefeller College, University of Albany at SUNY, and he will be speaking on ethnic and religious terrorism cross-nationally.
First of all, I have 2 main areas of research. Maybe at the next conference I'll deal with a second area. My first area of research is why people kill people they don't know. Okay? Do any of you have older siblings? Do any of you have younger siblings? Did you ever have a moment where you said, I want to kill that person? Right, okay, so I'm not suggesting you do so. Please don't take it as a suggestion. But criminal justice knows pretty well that 95 to 97% of all homicides are committed by people you know. By family members, by ex-family members, by loved ones, by ex-loved ones, by business partners. But there's a larger question about why you would go 400 miles out of your way and blow up a bunch of people you've never met before. And so that's one area of research that I look at, and we'll be talking about that in a minute or two. The other area of research that I look at is why people discriminate against people simply because they look different or have different preferences. So I have a lot of research on ethnic discrimination, discrimination against women, and discrimination against the LGBT communities. And I should note that the talk I'll be doing is about terrorism and non-state violence. As you mentioned before, there's a lot more of non-state violence at the moment. But let's be clear, the entities that have killed the most amount of people for the longest period of time have been governments. So if you have any questions, something's not clear, feel free during the talk just to raise your hand and I can address it quickly and we get to the longer questions at the end. Also, if you're interested in continuing this conversation after today, please feel free to send me an email. Okay. So the first thing we're going to talk about is why people use political violence in the first place, and I'm going to do a little bit of an overview of the current state of the literature. Okay? Now, the truth is, as Hobbes tells us, is for the most part, people don't use violence. And the reason they don't use violence is because if these are the individuals or non-state actors, this is the government. And people have their logic. The government has Roscoe. You may have logic. The government has Roscoe. And if Roscoe is saying, don't do this, you're likely not to do it. Okay, so our default here is you don't use violence because it's a good way to get yourself killed. And most people don't want to be killed. Okay? So to get a better sense of this, let's say you're getting treated badly. The sheep are angry about their barn, they're angry about their bad food, they're angry about getting sheared. Let's band together and tell Farmer Bob how we feel, said Stevie Sheep, for together we are strong. So all the sheep marched together to see Farmer Bob. What the blank do you want? Asked Farmer Bob, holding out the biggest pair of shears any of the sheep had ever seen. Strong Stevie Sheep said, me and my united sheep brothers wish to present you with some demands, said Stevie Sheep. What sheep brothers? Asked Farmer Bob. Everybody ran away. Okay, and this happens a lot. Stevie Sheep was sheared like he had never been sheared before. And the lesson, of course, is this is your guide to being a team player. So remember, kids, never be the one to speak up. I'm not saying a word. And for many governments in the world, and for much of history, this is the way it goes. But sometimes people get so annoyed, right? They don't just turn over their noses and brooms to the rabbit with the heater, right? These are snow people, so the heater is a bad thing. They don't do that. They say, no, I am not putting up with this anymore. Okay, one of my students told me about Kalashnikitty, and I actually Googled it. God bless Google, and I came up. There is a Kalashnikitty, and there are all sorts of Kalashnikitty pictures. Sometimes people do pick up a gun and decide to resist. or decide to use violence. So the question is why? Well, one major explanation is grievance. Okay? So if you're here and here, maybe it's not so bad, but if you're down here and all of life, what all of life is getting crapped on continuously, at some point, if the choice is getting crapped on continuously or saying, you know what, I am going to protest. I am going to stand up. Now, some people protest and don't use violence, and some people protest and do use violence. And so grievance is a large argument in the literature about why people end up using violence. Another is ideology. So you were speaking about the good stuff in the Torah, but there's also not a lot of bad stuff in the Torah, right? So if anybody wants to read a really disturbing book, pick up the book of Joshua. Okay, has anybody here read the book of Joshua? Right? It's not a fun book. Unless you like slaughtering people, it's not a fun book. Okay? And most holy books have a book of Joshua in them. Okay, has anybody read the book of Revelations? Right? There's a lot of bad stuff here. And certain religious leaders can take this stuff and turn it into a justification for what Mark Juergensmeyer has called othering. Right? So if you're not a human being really, because you're not my faith, or you're not my skin tone, or you're not something else, then killing you really isn't a sin, and it's justified because you're the other, you're the evil. And in the same way that ideology can empower people to do wonderful, great things, so I just think of Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi, ideology can also be used to do terrible, horrible things. And to be clear, the ideology, anybody want to guess what ideology has killed the most people in the last 100 years? Anybody? It's not religion. It's not religious ideology. It's communism. Communist ideology has been used to justify the killing of the largest amount of people. Okay? Religious ideology is doing pretty well, but it's nowhere close in this last 100 years to communist ideology. Okay? Political opportunity structure. Now, what do I mean by political opportunity structure is this. Okay? So you gave a very good example of political opportunity structure earlier. Okay? What are the chances in the early 60s that you were going to get beat up if you protested against oppression of African Americans? Pretty good. Okay? The chances you were going to get killed? Lower. If you compare those chances if you were protesting the treatment of Chechens in Russia under a communist regime, you weren't going to get beat up as a Chechen if you were protesting. You were going to get shot in the head. Done, finished. And the Russians actually picked up more than 1 million Chechens and moved them to Siberia in the late 40s and early 50s because they were so annoyed with them saying we should get what we want. So democracy, however ill-formed, presents an opportunity to say, you know what, I'm protesting. And it says the likelihood that you're going to die is much less, so you have a window of protesting, of being contentious, without having to say, I'm forfeiting my life. If you have an autocracy, you're going to have a lot less, or dictatorship, you're going to have a lot less contention. But if you protest in Syria, as we saw in 2010, if you peacefully protest in Syria, what is going to happen to you? You're going to die. So if you're going to protest, you might as well, a logic of political opportunity structure, you might as well just go ahead and pick up a gun. Right? Does that make sense to everybody? So this is the opportunity structure argument. And resources matter also. Okay? If you're dirt poor and you do not have access to resources and you're being oppressed, but if you're really poor, what's your main concern? Being oppressed or something else? What's the other thing? Food. Right? If you don't have the resources to eat, you're going to worry more about eating than about oppression. And so resources can make a big difference in terms of the direction that contention can go. So a lot of the research that is out there has been focused at the country level. So we now have a pretty good grasp at the country level when violence is going to start, where it's going to be, what level it's going to be at the country level. But a lot of what is missing here is just because there's a certain level of violence in a country doesn't tell us why certain groups are doing it, other groups are not, and why certain organizations are violent and certain organizations are not violent. So there are organizations, Palestinian organizations, for example. Some Palestinian organizations are violent. Some Palestinian organizations are not violent. Why? And looking at that kind of question is one of the things that myself and my colleagues are very interested in. I spent a great deal of time collecting numerical data to be able to use statistical analysis to try and give us some insight into these questions. So the theoretical model we're using is there's behavior. Behavior should not, I don't think, should be explained by one thing. Behavior can be explained by several things. One thing is the organizational environment. So remember we said democracy, autocracy. That's an organizational environment issue. Also capabilities, relations. How many people here have gotten a job or gotten some benefit by knowing somebody? Okay. It's not as many hands as I've seen in other places, but yeah, I mean, who you know has a huge impact on where you end up and what happens to you. And then just regular attributes, capabilities. So Donald Trump is very, very wealthy. Do you think it has anything to do with the fact that Donald Trump's father was also very, very wealthy? Right? And I may desperately have wanted to be in the NBA. Okay? But at 5'3", my chances of being in the NBA are practically non-existent, leaving aside the fact that I'm really bad at basketball. Okay? So attributes matter, and then goals. So sometimes organizations do something because the target of opportunity presents itself, and sometimes they're really motivated by the goals themselves. And we think the different issues here will get together depending on the behavior we're asking. Some of these things may be important, but they're all likely, for general behavior, they're all likely to have some kind of impact. Okay? So the first data set I'm going to talk to you about is the Minority Risk Organizational Behavior data set. It's a data set of ethno-political organizations, organizations that claim to represent an ethno-political minority in the Middle East. And it's organizations, yearly data collected for organizations that have existed for at least 3 years from 1980 to 2004. So that's the data that I'm analyzing in this analysis. So for example, Kurdistan, Kurds in Iraq, the Kurdistan Democratic Party, Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, Shia in Lebanon, Hezbollah and Amal, Palestinians in the occupied territory, Hamas, Fatah, PIJ, and so forth. Okay? And the first question we're going to look at here is, in MENA, in Middle East and North Africa, why do these ethno-political organizations start using violence in the first place? So we use something called a hazard model that looks at when organizations go from nonviolent, so all organizations at the beginning of our analysis are nonviolent. Why do some of these organizations pick up a gun and start shooting people? So these are our findings. And some of these I think are actually pretty important. One is gender ideology. That is, organizations that claim that you should treat women equally are much less likely to use violence in the first place. Okay? It doesn't mean they never use violence. So, for example, the PKK, as people here have heard of the PKK, the PKK is very egalitarian as far as groups go, and they certainly use a lot of violence. But in general, groups that advocate for women's equality are much less likely to use violence. Democratic groups that claim a democratic ideology are much less likely to use violence. Leftist groups, this was a little bit of a surprise to me, leftist organizations, most of them have a communist ideology, are 5 times more likely to use violence. Okay? And we're going to get back to this. Religious ideology does not seem, for the use of violence, does not seem to be having a statistically significant impact. Now note, this is not organizations that are only religious. This is organizations that are ethno-political that also have a religious ideology. So an example of that would be Hamas, would be a combined organization in terms of ideologies. Okay, if an organization is allowed to and participates in electoral politics, they're less likely to use violence. And this speaks to maybe why governments should let everybody run, because if you let everybody run, even if they don't win, maybe they'll kill people less. if you treat people like crap, they're more likely to pick up guns. Okay? And we keep finding this in all the analyses that I do. There's also a little bit of Mean Girls in here, if anybody gets that movie reference. Okay? Early in a group's existence, if other similar ethnic groups are engaged in violence, they want to stand out, they don't use violence. As time goes on, if other groups continue to use violence and the situation stays the same, they start using violence. Okay? So if the repression and so forth continues and other groups are using violence, at some point they say, you know what? This business of trying to be good people is not working out for us. Time to pick up a gun. Okay. And note, this is all probabilistic. None of this is deterministic in how I'm discussing it. Okay? So, groups, the first analysis that I showed you is why groups use violence in the first place. But every morning we get up, and we have a choice of different strategies we can take. We can stay in bed and lose our job. We can go to our job. Some of us have the ability to stay in bed and also work from home, right? So you can choose different kinds of contention. You could choose not to do anything. You could choose nonviolent contention. You could choose a mixed strategy, or you could choose only violent contention. And so what we're looking at here now is not when you start, but if you have this buffet plate in front of you, this buffet menu in front of you, what do you choose? For menu A, for menu B, or for both? And an example of organizations that go back and forth, so here's the PFLP in the West Bank. For a period of time, they did violence only. Then they had a mixed strategy. We have a mixed, I mean they were doing both protests and violence. And then they went to a mixed strategy again, then violence only, then mixed, then violence, then nonviolent contention, then mixed, then violence only. Here's the PFLP in Lebanon, back and forth and back and forth, right? So you see that these organizations, if we break them down by their behavior over years, it can really change what kind of strategies they're using. So what we try to do here is we use something called a multinomial logit to do an analysis to try and get at, if you have your buffet tray, how do you choose what you're gonna do? Okay? And so one issue is the opportunity structure. And so if there's a possibility for safe nonviolent behavior, you're more likely to do safe nonviolent behavior. You might mix it with violence, but you're more likely to do those protests. Active repression, we believe that the more active repression you're going to have, the more likely you're going to either use a mixed strategy or a purely violent strategy. Diaspora support. I don't know how many people I've met, people from the diaspora, who were really eager for the people living in their own country to pick up guns and shoot people. Now, why should people in the diaspora say, yes, Irish, go kill English? Okay, if I'm sitting in a pub, I went to college in Boston in the 1980s. I can't tell you how many people I know who were saying the IRA should be blowing up more people in the UK. Why is it so much easier for diaspora people to say that? Right, no one's going to shoot them. It's great. It's like playing a video game. It happens on the video game. It doesn't happen to me. Great. And so they're more likely to support those groups that are going to get their angers out, but they're not going to have to pay the cost. So a diaspora sort should have that impact. Domestic presence. If you are a domestic presence, we believe you'll be less likely to use violence. And the easy way to think about that is how do your teenagers behave when mom is at home, and how do they behave when mom is not at home? And mom at home is like domestic. You can't get away from the repercussions. And if no one is there, you can do what you want. So domestic presence has an impact. Social service is often thought of as a good thing, and it is a good thing. But in many ways, the state in the 21st century does two things. It has the guns, and it provides the services. So if an entity that is challenging the state is also providing social services, they're challenging the state even more. Does that make sense? So that should argue that we should see more of mixed and violent strategy. Ideologies. So since religious ideologies and leftist ideologies in very different way advocate for revolution, because if you think about religious ideologies advocate for revolution, we should see them more associated with violence. Okay, and then we already spoke about gender ideologies. So let me just get down to basics here. What we see here is when it comes to democratic ideology, it's more likely to push towards traditional and nonviolent and really push against violence. So is domestic presence. Diaspora support makes you much, much more likely to use violence for the reasons we just talked about. Gender exclusion, i.e. women don't count, keep them in the home, makes you much more likely to use violence, if that's the ideology of the group. Gender inclusion makes you much less likely to use violence. Religious ideology actually does not make you more likely to use nonviolence or violence. It actually makes you more likely to use traditional approaches. Leftist ideology, more likely to use violence. State repression makes it less likely to use traditional politics and less likely to use nonviolence and more likely to just go ahead and start blowing stuff up. Social services, more likely to use violence. One other thing I would like to note that's interesting, so a lot of times people say religious ideology makes you more likely to use violence. That's not what we're finding. What we're finding, though, is that once you start using violence, if it's a religious organization, so it doesn't make you more likely to start using violence, but once you start using violence, it makes you more likely to target civilians. Remember we talked about the othering component? So it doesn't make you more likely to jump off the ship, but once you jump off the ship, you're going to start acting like a shark.